Let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 2. Just hold that place there. And if you want, you can page over to Ezra. Just briefly. Ezra chapter 1. And hold that page for a moment as well. Daniel is in his place of prominence. This is that place in a child of God's life when suddenly you realize you're right in the center of God's will. Oftentimes you are trying to find it. What does God want me to do? Often it is, of course, exactly where we are. But Daniel's in the center of God's will, doing the center of God's work right now. And we've gone through this dream, the interpretation of it, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Of course, God gave this absolutely profound dream vision to Nebuchadnezzar about the history of the world. I've said that so many times, and I realized I probably should have quantified this a little bit more distinctly. And I'll do it this way. When we come to this world, we're born, we start to grow up, and we have this amazing ability to consider ourselves as the center of the world. Yes. And understand, I mean, you have your own consciousness. That's where you start from. And it took mankind quite a while to figure out that all of the sun and everything isn't revolving around us, so to speak. That's that same mindset. That's how we got that one to begin with. It's not like we go, well, we probably are not the center and we're revolving around something else. That's not what they thought. Because human bent is that we are the center. And it takes a good deal of work on God's part to show us that we're not. Right? Now, who is the center? Jesus Christ. Right? I think we could all agree with that. If you want to say God, that works as well. Right? But that is the true center of everything. So, and why I'm bringing this up is this. We are looking at this dream, the interpretation of it, and we quickly came to realize, of course, by explanation and also just by sort of observation, looking at it, but the dream is about kingdoms. And it's this comprehensive, if you would, not exhaustive, but comprehensive. It takes care of everything from Nebuchadnezzar's time to the end of time. Now, what the focus is this timeline of history as it relates to the center of the world, if you would, Jesus Christ. I'll say it a different way in this. There was other things that happened in the world, from gold to the rock coming and smashing the feet, and then it all goes up in chaff. There's a time, a period of time in that's revealed. There's other things that are actually happening, of course, in the world. We're talking about kingdoms here, and we're saying there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the sixth one, if you would, is when that rock cut without hands hits and it's done, and now we're at the end, right? That's number 6. But if you pull back and look at the world, there's other kingdoms, if you would. There's other empires, go into Chinese history, right? I mean, there's massive amounts of earthly history that don't show up here at all, right? They don't show up here. Now, what does that tell you? Well, it's not that complicated. It's just that We are looking at the history of the world from God's perspective, not man's perspective. He's looking at the history of the world, unfolding it now. Why are we talking about from Nebuchadnezzar on? We've talked about this a few times, but do you know that the Babylonians were the ones God used to come in and take Judah captive? We're going to start there. Now, I prefaced this all to reintroduce something in your minds about. I want to emphasize, at least in the beginning of this morning session here, that what's happening now with Daniel in Babylon is so different than what God intended originally. And we've talked about this so many times. He changes plans. His purpose is the same. What's his purpose? The purpose is the center of the world, Jesus Christ. That center that is not going to waver. It's not going to change. But if I was to take you back into, let's say, Exodus or any of the first five books of the Bible, and talk to you about how God's plan is just unfolding for His people, right? And of course, we get the early stories of Genesis of them, ending up in Egypt, 70 people strong, kind of God's people, if you would. And then, but they're going to come out eventually, right, by the power of God and the hand of Moses in it. And then what does God set out to do? Well, we've done this so many times. He moves them to the promised land. They're going to wipe the slate clean, and they're going to start a new thing. And now watch. It is object lesson after object lesson after object lesson after object lesson after object lesson to teach God's people to listen to Him. Right? I mean, the waters of Meribah, for instance. And the manna. You take it anywhere you want to go in all this, and then they get into the promised land, right, with the Mount Sinai and all. They get to the commandments, and it's just follow me, do my statutes, do my commandments, obey me. Let's go. We got work to do. We got a thing. We're going to set up this thing. We're going to do this city on a hill, and it is. Again, it's teaching. God's teaching. God is teaching. He's leading. He's teaching. He's teaching. He's teaching. It's without remedy. Unreal. And now we're looking at a man named Daniel. And he's, if you would, alone in Babylon. Where's all the teaching and all this? Well, now it's going to... It's zeroing in on a God-fearing man who is in captivity in Babylon. And God, He's not going to be stopped even though this thing failed because of man's sin. He's still going to move it forward. But you see you can feel the anticipation of God, what He was doing in building up this people that was going to follow Him and be this light set up on a candlestick so that the whole world would see they've listened, they've obeyed, and they've come to a place where they're just following God and listening to Him, and then He had put none of the diseases that are in Egypt on them. And everybody else is supposed to be around going, how in the world is that possible? Why aren't you guys getting sick? Right? That should have been the scratching head question of the world around. How can you guys have it so good? Because this world's a mess, right? We're all in this mess. And how come you guys, that was going to be the driving force around the people around the world. We're going to look, the known world, so to speak, with the focus. Now watch this. Where? Israel. Jesus. It's all focused right in there. They're not looking elsewhere. The focus isn't elsewhere. the focus is the same, Pete. It's still the same. If you want to figure out what's happening in the world history and stuff like what's happening now, we should be looking to see what's happening around that Israel place. It's still the same. There's nothing to say it's changed. That is, that focus hasn't changed. Has the plan changed? Oh, good grief. Absolutely. That's what we're looking at. A complete change again. Right? Now, I had you page over, we're in Daniel, we're going to come back in there, but that Ezra, when the book of Ezra opens up, and by the way, of course, you were looking at this if you were in a small group. This is what the passage that we have, right? The first verses in Ezra. But it says in chapter 1, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord of the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. And that's enough. I'll just read that much. King of what? Where? Persia. Okay, we're in Daniel. Well, Persia's not ruling right now with Daniel. It's the Babylonians. Right? Ezra, when Ezra hits, we're already in the silver. Silver what? This guy. No longer, we're not in the gold anymore. When Ezra hits, we're in the silver. And it's going to move, of course, from silver, we're going to move into the brass, right? We talked about that already in previous weeks. But we're going to, once you're in the brass, where are you in terms of God's people? Because your vision should always go from, if you're looking through history, what is going on with God's people? Where are they? Where are they in the timeline of this? So we know that Babylon, right, Babylon's there, right at the end of this stuff. With regard to God's people, Babylon happened here. Right? They go into captivity, 70 years. Daniel's going to still be writing at the end of those 70 years captivity. And then he's going to be there when Cyrus steps in. Silver. It's moving. What's moving? The vision. The vision and human history is moving already. Moving where? It's moving from gold, silver, brass, iron, clay, the rock element. 1, 2, 3. You can count them. You can count them. In fact, you can count them with one hand. And then comes the kingdom of God, right? So, but you can count them as related to Jerusalem. On one hand. This isn't all the kingdoms of the world. It's not the Ottoman kingdom, all the dynasties that went through China, Mongolia, and all those kind of dynasties, right? They're all out there. But they're not focused here. They're not having, if you would, they're not having an important enough impact on the nation of Israel to be recorded in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. That's significant. Why? Because that gives you a pretty good idea of where God's focus is. For instance, if it was America, that God's focus was, that America would show up in this. And I mean, specifically, it's all revolved around what happens during that time that has an impact on America. Or would it work at Canada? But that's not God's point. He's writing history from his perspective about the most important timeline, if you would, what's going to happen. God's timeline. So I don't know, I think over even the last 25 years or something, I mean, Christendom has started to, it seems to me, that I heard a lot of whisperings that were sort of against Israel scenario. Why bother going there? Why? And you see it all over. I mean, I remember walking around parts of Oakland, and there was all this signage against the Jews having their land. I was like, well, where's this coming from? I thought that was done way back. It's not done. And it's still not done, right? It's still not done. They're still questioning it. God doesn't question it since he said it. When did he say it? Well, at least back in Abraham's time, right? I'm going to give you a land. And he hasn't changed his mind. And when so now we are at what timeline? 605 BC, 600 years before Christ. He says, okay, guys, humankind, I'm going to give you a timeline now. We're going to lay it out from now to the end. And here it is. Boom, boom, boom. Gold, silver, brass, iron clay. Okay? And it's all focused on what's happening with God's people in his land. It's amazing. And are you going to try to change his mind? I don't think you can do that. Right? He's got it set. He set what was going to happen is from a perspective that is definitive. He's not wavering, right? And we've talked about this. We now in hindsight 2020, we look back, okay, that was the Babylonians, that was the Medes and Persians, so forth. We got this. But now we're in this sort of, where are we? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, I think we're in the 5th. There's nothing else left. Right? There's nothing left. We're in 5. So now, okay, we're in the 5th one, and whenever you're in it, you're going to have the least ability to see it. Like exactly where it is. Because now you don't have 2020. But you can look back at it, and that's of course what we've been doing. God's focus is now, the focus is the same, but his approach from what God was doing with the nation of Israel, and this the relentless teaching. And when that plan broke because of mankind, he went into a whole different plan. And guess what? That next plan with Daniel is essentially exactly the same as it is with you and me. He wants to work out of the home of one person, if you would. One temple, one vessel, filled with the knowledge of truth, and taking that truth, and again, we read about the Dead Sea earlier this week. I was reading about it, but I think it was on the devotional. But it just contrasted, of course, the Sea of Galilee, which is vibrant with fish and just life abundant around it, right? And feeding trees and all this stuff. And of course, as the Jordan flows down from there, the same water that's flowing into there flows down to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea has got no life. There's no fish flopping around there. No trees that it's sustaining. It's just this absolute dead thing. Who wants to hang out there? Want to go fishing? Okay, why? You don't even want to be there. Because it never lets go of any of that water. It's just stagnant, super saturated salt. You water, right? If you are a vessel and everything just comes in and you never let anything go out, you're just a stagnant Dead Sea thing. He doesn't want that. He's pouring all the truth that he has into us. And as Christians, if we walk around like a Dead Sea, that is just, there's no life around us. Nobody gets, sustained by us or fed by us, or, right? And it's not even us. It's supposed to be flowing through us, right? Exactly like Sea of Galilee. Comes in, goes out. A lot of Christians sit in the pews, right? And it comes in, it just comes in, and it comes in, and it just comes in. It's supposed to be overflowing, right? God's not looking for little stagnant Dead Seas in his body. That's not what he's after. It's a different plan. You got that, right? But we're supposed to be this city, he uses it now for us. Our life is supposed to be so different that people around, unsaved, would go, okay, that's odd. Why are you so odd? Why does it appear that you are so different? Now, they may not phrase it that way, but they're going to fish around for some answers going, what's up? And sometimes, maybe in the beginning, they'll just come to argue. Right? But God is expecting something now. He's changed plans. What you're seeing unfold with Daniel, which is a remarkable example for us, right? It's a beautiful example. But he really would have that be each of his people. Okay, come back to Daniel. Now, Daniel chapter 2, verse 36, and on. This is the interpretation of the dream, chapter 2, verse 36. And we will tell the interpretation there before the king, and he goes on and he tells him, right? He is the gold, right? Thou art King of kings. For the God of heavens hath given thee a kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar, power and strength and glory, and wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. Sorry, I'm at verse 38. And it says, and after thee shall arise another kingdom. Now, very clearly talking about kingdoms, he's moving on, right? Well, this another kingdom we already read in Ezra. That's the one coming after. And then another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of the potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. That one, the iron. But there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron, part of clay, so that kingdom shall be partly strong, partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. I'm going to pause there. Now, we've been walking through this statue, if you would, gold, the significance. And as I'm reading the significance, I've tried to emphasize that as well. The significance is as it relates to God's purpose. Like a laser beam, just focused. So all this stuff that's going to unfold, piece by piece by piece, in human history, has got this laser beam focus on God's purpose. Right? So we had, most recently, we were looking at the Greeks. But I'll give you just a brief summary, and by the way, I'm going to give you a little bit of a timeline. The timeline is not that easy to decipher from all the many scholars out there. They don't agree necessarily 100%, but they're close to each other, so it won't make a whole lot of difference. The head of gold on the statue represents Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the Babylonian Empire. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's dad was Nabopolassar, and he started conquering in 626 BC. And he went on to somewhere around 539 BC. That is the Babylonian Empire. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar was prominent in that. So, if you did the math there, that's about 87 years. That gold head represents about 87 years. Okay? Something like that. Silver chest and 2 arms. We've read this about the Medo-Persian Empire. They conquered Babylon in 539. So that was that date that I said. It was 626 to 539. So they conquered, and that was, right there, that was that one chapter, we already read in Daniel, but it happens right there when Belshazzar is, got the writing on the wall, right? And he's all arrogant about it. But the Medo-Persians came in, conquered Babylon in 539, and then this silver kingdom lasted about 200 years. Approximately 205, but it fluctuates a little bit on the exact dates there, but 200 years is adequate to describe that silver portion. So the belly and thighs now bronze. This is the Greeks under Alexander the Great, particularly, right? Now he comes in like a leopard. Remember, he comes in fast, and he conquers the Medo-Persians in 334 through 330 or something like that, in that timeline. Now, watch what just happened. We just stepped into, if you have been listening in times past when people have been talking about the break between Old Testament and New Testament, how many years is that, sort of from the last writings of the Old Testament until Christ's sort of is announced? The angels start showing up and talking to people, and there's sort of an awakening. 400 years. 400 years is that gap between your Old Testament and your New Testament. 400 years. So now, if you read something like this, that the Medo-Persians were in that 330 timeline, well, guess where they're landed? Right in the silence of the Bible. Okay? This is, you understand? So, the Bible narrative has been moving along since the beginning of time. Our Bible has. It has gone along, and if you would, it has gone along and it has come to Nebuchadnezzar's date, if you would. That's the one God chose, when Nebuchadnezzar was in power. And that's when they went into captivity, and Daniel is taken captive and starts to record, and he's the one that interprets this dream, and God does through Daniel. So from eternity past, if you want, right, up to Nebuchadnezzar. We got that nailed. And then now comes Cyrus, right? The silver. A couple hundred years. And then, so that's already moving into, what did I say? That moves from 539 to 334. It is exactly during that time that it went, what time? During the Medo-Persian Empire, when the Bible goes silent. In terms of prophecy, in terms of any Holy Scriptures being written. You're just in the silver, if you have that little diagram. Yes?
Would the Maccabees have been an exception?
Not in terms of the canon. Yeah, so like they show up there, and this is we're going to hear about them, because even that, like God's going to use that, right? But let's just jump from that question on. So into this. So we are, the belly and thighs are bronze. That's the Greeks under Alexander the Great. He conquered in 334, 330 in that range. And then he's going to take us to somewhere around 63. Okay? Because that is when the Romans came in and conquered Jerusalem. That's why you choose that date. So Rome is going to rise up about there. So now they've gone, I'm just going to put that, it's about 250 years, 270, something like that. That the Greeks are sort of in their empire. So first one was what, 87 years, the next one is around 200, 205. This one is now, the third one is around 270, something like that. And now, Rome. Now Rome is a longer period now. This is that the iron, and of course, the iron and clay is going to come. But this
is going to be somewhere around that 63 AD now, is going to move, and actually, so here's where it is. That Roman Empire started to build up about 27 BC, I think, something like that. But it started to grow in power, and then it built up all the way to 800, right, AD, and even on to 1800 by extension. So now you've got something like 1800 plus years for this one. Exactly, if you try to find out when the fall of Rome was, the Roman Empire, you're going to get all sorts of answers. Because it wasn't this is interesting, it wasn't a decisive thing. Like if you ask any historian, when was the fall of the Babylonian Empire? Well, they'll give you a date. Like almost a day, right? You ask that same question of the Roman Empire, it's as scattered as 1800 years almost. Because it was absolutely slow, trickling, and painful. Drip, 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 drip. That it just dripped away, if you would. And that's what, now, what's going to happen with that Roman Empire too is it's going to fall. There will be a fall, and it's going to break into pieces. And if you would, you take a look. If you look at a map, for instance, of Europe, early maps of Europe, it's got all these little countries, right? Well, those are the pieces. Those are the pieces that fell out, and they are. And the historians know too. You know, it was typically something with like the Roman Empire. It was this vast, but it had all these little empires in it, right? And the fall came because these guys all wanted their independence. You know, okay, well, that makes sense. You see that all the time, right? I mean, that was the USSR thing too. They wanted their independence, and that's what this big thing broke down into these pieces. And that's that. And then of course they sit beside each other, but they're not mingled. Right? It's that clay iron doesn't mix scenario. Okay, with that bit of background there, I wanted to do this. We had moved through the Greeks, and I'll give you some of this, but again, always in relationship to God's purpose and His kingdom that is to come, of course. But with regard to Christ, what did the Greek Empire have to do? What's the significance with regard to God's purpose, that Messiah? Alexander the Great was the guy that he liked to go around and leave his name in the cities he conquered. You could change their name to Alexandria. A little bit arrogant, I guess. But he, I guess, earned it. I don't know. Let's see. I'll just want to read the significance. This is it. Perhaps as impressive as his military success, which was amazing, we read about that previously, but his advancement of Greek culture called Hellenism. In every city Alexander conquered, he instituted schools to teach Greek. Remember, we talked about that? So, all his conquered empire, Alexander, he forced the people to learn Greek. And he instituted not just the language, but the philosophy of the Greeks. And as I mentioned, Pastor Rob talked about that when he was talking about John writing. And John was writing both to the Greeks and to the Jews. And because of that Greek philosophy that had been permeated and instituted in those nations that they conquered, they knew what he was talking about with regard to that Greek philosophy. The word, right? Let's see. Hubs of Hellenism precipitated a major cultural change and had enormous impact on world history and in particular Bible history. The New Testament was written, of course, in Greek. The widespread use of the Greek language aided the sharing of the gospel from India to Spain. Greek philosophy gave us the concept of logos, which John used as a way to communicate the nature of Christ, it says here, and so on. So now, you talk also about the Maccabees, and I'll just touch on that here because let's see. For the history of the divided Greek kingdom, empire, and how it impacted Jewish history, they turned to the Apocrypha. Because, why do they turn to the Apocrypha?
400 years back.
Because now we're in that silent part, right? So you come along with world history all the way along, boom, boom, Old Testament, and the Old Testament stops talking during the time of the Medes and Persians. And then it changes, during that silent time, it changes power to the Greeks, Alexander the Great. And what happens is, Alexander, he came and he conquered, what was it, 13 years, right? It was a phenomenally short period of time, and he conquered the known world. And then he instituted Hellenism in all these places. The Greek language and the Greek philosophy and so forth, and he instituted that, boom, boom, boom. But he died, right, suddenly. Now, what it says is, he was of course prophesied, but and we will get into this a little bit further when we get into like the Greeks in particular, Alexander the Great and so forth. He is prophesied 3 times in Daniel. So Daniel chapter 2, we're reading about it here. We're going to read about it again in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11. And it's going to go, in fact, Daniel chapter 8 zeroes in on Alexander the Great. And that, I won't go there right now, but remember, it's the main horn that gets bust right at the height of the epitome sort of its power. And then it gets broken in, and then there's these little horns. Well, the prophecy that Daniel recorded 200 years in advance is true in every detail. Alexander died in Babylon in 323. They know the date, at the age of 33. And his kingdom was then divided among his 4 generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus or something, and Cassander. Now, I only mention those 4 names because the second guy is this Seleucus. He was the general that had jurisdiction over the Jews, Jerusalem. He was a tyrant. Evil as the day is long. And he was the one that in 167, well actually I should read a little bit more of this before I go there. Let's see. They're turning to the Apocrypha to get some information on. Alexander the Great's generals put crowns upon themselves and their sons for many years, it says. This is written in the Apocrypha. It's in Maccabees, by the way, the book of Maccabees in that document. The Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucid Empire is one of these little empires that was a piece of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great died, and his world empire got divided into 4 pieces by his 4 generals. They each got a piece. Well, this Seleucid guy was over the Jews. And he started to torment them, persecute them a lot, right? So the Seleucid Empire ended up with control over Palestine and Jerusalem, and one of the Seleucid kings eventually was Antiochus IV, who called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. Wrong name, unless you're really it, right? Unless you're it, don't take that name. Unless you are Jesus Christ, do not take that name. Well, this guy did. So, do you think Satan's involved in any of this? Oh, good grief. But who's running the bigger show? God. Understand what I said earlier. All that his intent was, right, with teaching the people, his people teaching, object lesson. Okay, we'll do a different plan. Now I'm going to have individuals. We're going to change this thing. My Messiah's still going to come. And by the way, we're going to put a little pause on all this talk. But I'm going to be as in charge with laying out what's going to happen in the history of the world as if I was telling people what to do. And they were listening. You see that? This was his intent, to have people that would obey him, listen to him, and he'd get it done that way. They said, I'm not doing that. He tossed it. God says, okay, but this is without remedy right now, you guys, but I'm gonna continue my purpose now, and I'm gonna work out world history, so it's still gonna happen. I will still get it done. I'll still get it done. And he's going to allow these things to happen. So the Seleucid Empire ended up with control over Palestine, and this guy, this Antiochus guy, he committed what was called the abomination of desolation. You ever heard that? Right, yeah. Well, he went in, he set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus inside the Jewish temple. Okay, this guy, the Seleucid Empire, they're ruling over Palestine, and this guy, this God manifest guy, right? He goes into the Jewish temple and he sets up a statue to this Greek god, an altar to this Greek god, and guess what he sacrifices on it? A pig, right? Now, this is called being yea no. To the extent, to the extreme. Alan, explain yea no.
It actually says it twice, that you're against. It actually, the Old German actually says it twice. Yeah.
Against.
Toward, against.
Kicking against the pricks.
It's not a nice
King James.
term.
Oh, no.
To charm.
It's like a double negative in the Old German.
Yeah, and this guy, it's like, you know, he whatever Satan wants him to do, he does. That's, I mean, he's just a mess. Now, this is significant because this is when the Maccabees, this guy, Matthias, right? I think that's his name, yeah. So in the village, okay, this Antiochus proceeded to require pagan sacrifices in all the Jewish villages, right? So in the village, one of these villages of Modane, a Levite named Mattathias had 5 sons, and he was told, in that village, you make that sacrifice. The same one that we did in Jerusalem with the pig on the altar and to Zeus and all this stuff, you do it in your village, you have to, right? And Mattathias refused, and he killed the troops of Antiochus. This was the Maccabean revolt. And now, that sparked the Maccabean revolt, and that was led by Mattathias' sons, these 5 sons. And guess what happened? Israel gained its freedom from the Seleucids for a period of time, and was later recognized as an independent state by the Roman Senate. Now, you know who helped the Maccabees? Rome. The Romans did. We're dealing, at this point in time, right, it's the Greeks. We've had Babylon, right? We have the Medes and Persians. Now we have the Greeks who's coming up, Romans. Well, these guys, this Greek Empire, after Alexander the Great, they put this Seleucid guy in charge over Jerusalem, and he made such a mess, and it was so Antichrist-ish, right? that it pushed the Maccabees to revolt, and in support, they had Romans who were already starting to rise in power. What's the next empire to come after these Greeks guys? The Romans. What I'm pointing out, there was already alliance between Rome and the Jews happening back in here. There was already a agreement. You got that enemy, we got that same enemy. Let's work together. Well, that's what happened with the Greeks. And of course, the Romans came in and conquered them. So, Roman Empire is next. Where have we got? We got a few minutes. I want to touch on this, and then we can sort of got to the end, at least, of the significance in these guys. Roman Empire. was the human political entity that God used to prepare the world for the birth of Messiah. God's hand is in all of this stuff. This whole unfolding of kingdoms that God is allowing to rule until the time of Christ, of course, and then there's going to be this time this rock is going to hit, and of course, Christ is the beginning of that hit, if you would. At the end of the Old Testament, Israel had returned from exile. So that's where I should have mentioned that, actually. That's a good point that he brought up there. When the Old Testament comes to its silent time, they have returned from exile. That's what we've read in Nehemiah and so forth. Yep.
Any idea how many people actually returned?
No, I wish, I'm hoping I can find some idea yet, but I don't know. I don't know if the historians,
I was looking for it as well.
yeah, I couldn't find, at least not any clear information. It was significant enough to run the city, and that there was a sort of a self-government happening. So it was a large amount to some extent. Okay. At the end of the Old Testament, Israel had returned from exile. Jerusalem had been rebuilt. The temple had been reconstructed and was functioning again. So this is where we are at the end of the Old Testament writing when it goes quiet. All right? That's where they're setting up. Now, this is when things are going to move from one empire to the next, including over to the Romans. The world empire was the Medes when it closed, when it quieted down, when the Holy Scriptures quieted. And in these 400 years between the Testaments, the Greek Empire rose to prominence under Alexander, as we read about, but then splintered upon his death, and Israel was persecuted by these Seleucids, they're called. I think I'm pronouncing that somewhat correctly. One of the splinter kingdoms of the Greek Empire. They were based in Syria. And the Seleucid ruler Antiochus was the one that was particularly brutal. He was this manifest God guy. He had forced Hellenization of the Jews and profaned the temple. Now, hear that. He enforced the Hellenization of the Jews. What does that mean? That means they had to learn Greek. They had no choice. Well, they could die. but if you wanted to hang around, you had to learn Greek. What language is the New Testament written in? Greek. That's why. It's God's unfolding. He said, we're going to get this done. I fully expect that the New Testament was supposed to be written in Hebrew. That would seem like the most obvious. I think that's what he would have originally had. It's going to be written in Greek. Painfully, so it got there, right? But that's what it's written in. So, he enforced the Hellenization of the Jews and profaned the temple. His actions led to the Maccabean revolt, in which Israel expelled the Greeks and they gained their independence. And during that time of the revolt, the Maccabees were supported, here it is, by the up-and-coming Romans. So they're not in power yet, but they're coming. And they're assisting the Maccabees to get their independence. So now the power of Rome grew, became an empire, and it swallowed up all of this stuff, Israel, Palestine included. But the Jews were allowed to maintain their religious practices. See, they had already figured some things out. Remember? This works better if you let the people keep their stuff, so to speak, and their religious practices and their economy, and then they can still pay tribute. But if you just annihilate them and take them and put them out there, you got to put other people in there to keep the land occupied and sort of running. But then they got to start from scratch, build up their economy before they can start paying taxes. So they kept people in place, let them have their religious practices, and kept them. What is it? It's keeping them happy, appeasing. There's a technique there. You ever think you're being appeased? Sometimes we are. Sometimes that's the government's tactic. Keep them happy.
Checks.
and they'll figure it's just good enough. Just a side note, but it's still being used today, is my point in this. Okay. Where are we? Up and coming Rome was helped. Now, the Jews were allowed to maintain their religious practices as long as they did not make trouble for Rome. Okay? Rome placed a series of puppet kings in place. Herods. Ha! Puppet king is right. They looked the part, but they didn't have the power of the part. And they knew it. Sometimes it made them angry. Sometimes they'd lash out. Make them look like they were powerful. They, do you know, and you'll probably mention this, but think about this. How was it that Paul could do so much? Well, God was on his side, obviously, right? But from the human perspective, you know that when he said, I appeal to who? Caesar. Everybody goes, whoo! Hands off. Give the guy a house. We're going to keep him captive, but put him in a house. Keep him fed. Keep him happy. Can friends come visit? Yeah, easy. I mean, the power that Rome had, ultimately, right, over a Roman citizen now, and they had prestige. What God had in place by the time Paul was walking around with the gospel was a lot of flexibility. And they had nice robes. Compared to, right? God had already allowed a lot. I'm getting ahead of myself in here, but let's just read through some of this further here. We're right at the end here. We'll just try to summarize a bit more. Let's see. Touch on some big pieces. Scripture prophesied centuries before, of course, that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Well, how did they get there? Joseph and Mary were established in Nazareth. Well, Caesar Augustus, right? Roman Empire, Roman Emperor. He's mandated everybody's supposed to return home for registration. That's how they ended up in Bethlehem. And now we have, I mean, if you're watching this timeline, now we're coming, now the Romans are in power, right? We're down number 4, if you would. All this other history's gone past. We are moving towards, did you ever hear Christ say we're in the end times? Obviously. In fact, there's a point to be made that when Christ came, this is already part of the rock covenant, right? So when he says we are in the last days, look, if you're looking at this timeline from God's perspective, how many more kingdoms are there coming? No. I mean, we're at the end. When he says last days, he knows what he speaks of. Well, so if each of these is the days of Nebuchadnezzar, no, the days of the Babylonians, well, that's like 87 years. The days of the Medes and Persians, well, that's like 200 years. The days of, what do we got? The Greeks. Now we got something longer, right? 280 or whatever. The days of the Romans. Well, now we got like 1,500 years or something like that. But now we're in the last days, he says. Coming, yeah. Doesn't that make perfect sense? He's speaking exactly what the timeline is talking about. We're in the last days now. Does those last days, how long do they last? I don't know. They could last a couple of thousand years, apparently. Right? Well, what's the big deal? The other guys did it with 1,400. Right? Or whatever. He was accurate in his assessment, of course, in those last days. He's always accurate. But we can't go any further. We're right at the end of our deal. But one of the priorities, I'm going to read this. I read this the other day, and I'm going to read it again, just an ending. One of the priorities of the Roman Empire, perhaps the main priority, was peace. And they did that by ruling with an iron hand. Now, listen. When Christ was crucified, who was on either side? Thieves. How many thieves do you think had around if you get crucified for people? Do you think that keeps some peace? Good. Do you know why they hung him up in public? so that other potential thieves are going by and going, I think I'm gonna change my occupation. I haven't been caught yet, I think it's time to stop. That's called ruling with a hand of iron. If you don't want thieves, you give them a treatment that nobody wants. And that should be a deterrent. And that's the way they rule. So that you could actually walk from Jerusalem to Damascus and not always get mugged. Right? They ruled with an iron hand to make peace. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you rule with grace to provide peace. And of course, we praise you for how you unfolded history to bring about the Messiah that would arrive and give us that peace, offer that peace to us freely and absorbing our sin amazingly. Thank you for how you unfolded history and you made your purpose come to pass despite having to change plans as often as you did. I pray that you help us now to take that light that you put in us, that gospel message, the truth, and that we would be these vessels of honor that would go out now, and that water would flow through us and touch those around. In Jesus' name.